Part 2, Chapter 11. Ma and Jivanti Mataji stayed in Kechi ashram for most of the year. The ashram would be closed during the winter months with only the essential temple services continuing. The formal reopening of the ashram was on the 16th April. It began with the singing of Ram Nam Kirtan by singers from Vrindavan, and this would continue for the next 6 months. The daily Bhandara would also start from this day. Both the mothers would be in Kechi now onwards. The mothers would follow a certain pattern of travel during the year. After the 15th June Bhandara, they would go for a retreat in the interior of the hills for a month or more. This was called the Ekantwas, and the destination would be known only to a few. Utmost secrecy was maintained in selecting an appropriate place for their stay so that the mothers could spend an undisturbed and restful period. On their return from Ekantwas, it would be the time for Guru Purnima and Ma would go to Kenchi or proceed to Rishikesh. For Maharajji's Punya Tithi in September, Ma would invariably be in Vrindavan. Her longest continuous stay in Kechi would be in the months of May and June, and also in October for the Shardiya Navratri Puja. In the winter months after the ashram closed, the mothers would often go to snow-laden Badrinath for Dipavali. After that, accompanied by a few devotees, they would begin their travels. Usually they went southward first, to Rameshwaram or Tirupati, where the climate was warmer. From there, they might journey eastwards to Jagannath Puri or westward to Dwarka. For Makar Sankranti, Ma and Choti Mataji were often in Prayag, and Holi was, of course, always in Brijbhumi, Vrindavan. After Holi, the mothers would return to Kechi in time for 16th April. Besides these travels, Ma would also visit Maharajji's temples, ashrams, and the village of Neem Karoli regularly. I had often heard about Ma's travels and pilgrimages with Maharajji, and since then I had begun to secretly nourish a desire to travel with Ma someday. I felt that in a different environment, without the ashram protocol and decorum, I would get to see a different side of Ma. This proximity would also help me overcome the many hesitations, the many self-imposed restraints that were in my mind. One winter morning, on her morning round of the ashram in Kenchi, Ma walked into my room. It was unusual, so I was surprised. She sat on my bed and said, "Chal, Purangiri chalegi hamare saath? Come, will you come to Purangiri with me?" Before I could barely stammer a reply, Ma said that we would be leaving the next morning. There would be 2 cars, and one of the cars would be mine. In those days, I had a Fiat, bright apple green in color. That day, hoping against all hope that Ma might travel a part of the distance with me, I scrubbed the car to its soul. As written in the Puranas, after desecrating the yajna of Prajapati Daksha, when Bhagwan Shiv was bearing aloft the body of goddess Sati, parts of her mortal remains fell in various places which are now known as Shakti Pithas. Situated at an altitude of 5,500 feet on the Annapurna range, the Purnagiri Siddha Peeth is in the Champavat district of Uttarakhand. It is believed that the navel of the Devi fell here. In those days, an arduous trek of about 20 kilometers through dense forests up the rubble track the mountain led to the shrine. We departed from Kechi the next day. The mothers commenced the journey in the ambassador car, accompanied by the men, and the ladies in the group got into my car. After driving for 2 or 3 hours, a stop was made. The group went to a tea shop nearby. Both mothers silently disembarked from the ambassador and came and sat in my car. From there on, Ma continued to travel in the Fiat till we returned to Kechi. This was the start of many a drive over the next 37 years in my travels with Ma. Our base camp of the night was a forest dark bungalow at Boom near the town of Tanakpur on the banks of Sharada River. After the initial cleaning of Ma's room and a short break for rest, both mothers walked down to the riverside. The mother sat on the rocks, and we sat near them, on the sand. I remember how appreciative Ma was of the natural beauty all around. The calm river, the long shadows of the trees, and the reddish glow of the sun. Seeing my camera slung on my shoulder with a gentle pat upon my back, Ma asked me to feel free to take photographs. Again, this marked the beginning of my taking hundreds of photographs of the mothers and our pilgrimages over the years. After dusk, we lit a wood fire around which we sat and sang the evening prayers. After dusk, we lit a wood fire around which we sat and sang the evening prayers. Then we talked for a while. Ma told us that she had been to Purnagiri temple many years ago. I too had visited the shrine several times as a child, and we shared memories. A member of our group described to Ma a strange dream he had the night before. He said he had seen Baba Maharaj lying down, covered with rags, asking him for a cigarette. When he offered a cigarette in the dream, Maharajji took two drags and handed the cigarette back to him. The dream ended there. Ma listened very attentively, though she did not say anything. The next morning we started early, and soon we were climbing up the hill. The path was rocky and uneven. We had barely covered a short distance when Choti Mataji misplaced a step and fell down. Luckily, there were others around her to give immediate support. Except for a little stiffness, there was no injury as such. However, it meant that she would have to walk slowly with help. Ma was a habitual fast walker, and as she went ahead, I accompanied her. Making intermittent stops on the way to rest, we went past the most beautiful rivulets and waterfalls. The few pilgrims crossing our path would greet Ma with calls of Purnagiri Maiya ki Jai, Parvato Wali ki Jai. Ma and I would also respond to their calls with joy. Slowly we reached a dense forest of sal trees. Though it was winter, the entire landscape was covered with auburn leaves as in autumn. In the forest, we saw from a distance a man lying under a tree. Wrapped in a length of tattered tarp, he had almost blended into the floor of the forest. As we neared him, he roused himself and asked a person who was passing by for a cigarette. When given one, he took two drags of it and gave it back. Someone called out to say to us that there was a madman under the tree and that we should be careful. Ma shook her head and whispered, "Ye pagal nahi hai. He is not mad." As we drew close, we saw the figure lying still again, amidst the heap of twigs and leaves. Quietly, Ma sat down beside him. I stood by in silence. She kept looking up at the sky. Slowly, the figure moved and sat up facing Ma. He had no clothing on his body and had covered himself with the rag. Ma spoke to him in a very soft voice, and he seemed to be answering her. Their conversation lasted a minute or two. I had with me two apples for Ma. Taking these from me, Ma placed them gently in front of him. I was also carrying with me some singles, a donut-like preparation made in the kumao. Ma took a handful of these and placed them on the leaf nearby. After a moment, she picked one or two and giving them to me said, "ये यहाँ का प्रसाद है. इसको यहीं खा ले. This is prasad from this place. Eat it here right now." The man covered himself with his rag and lay down again, but this time his feet were not covered. Ma offered pranam and then said to me, "Charno ki photo le le. Take a photo of his feet." Those were the days of analog cameras, and printing photos took time. When I received the prints nearly a month later, the man's feet were identical to those of Baba Maharaj. In those days on mountain routes, the Brahmin priests would provide small huts on the way for pilgrims to take rest or spend the night. These clearings would be called padavs. After walking the whole day, as it began to get dark, we neared a padav, Tunias. Everyone began to discuss arrangements for the night. As if drawn to something, Ma simply entered a hut. We followed her. She stated that this was where we would spend the night. It was pitch dark inside. Soon the Pandit, who was called Mathurda, came running in with a lantern in his hand. In the flickering light cast by the flame, we saw a big murti of Hanumanji in the mud wall. That night, we ate simple aloo rasa with rotis for dinner. Even though it was December, what was unforgettable was that the sabji was so hot with chilies that we broke into a sweat that cold winter night. 2 coarse black blankets were provided to each of us as bedding. All the ladies slept in a row in that hut, with Ma and Choti Mataji on one side. The next morning we bathed in the bracing water of the mountain spring and resumed our trek. Ma and I walked ahead and reached the temple steps before the others. The improvised stairs were hewed out of the rocks in the mountain. A little before we reached the shrine, Ma decided to wait for Choti Ma. It was a calm and peaceful morning. The sky was a deep blue and the sunlight filtered in through the trees. As we sat there, I heard the coonch and sounds of bells amidst chants. Hearing these familiar sounds, I presumed there must be a crowd of pilgrims up at the shrine. I remembered that since the temple was situated at the top of the mountain peak, the little courtyard in front of the shrine was very small. I thought it would be best to wait till the people in the temple came down. Presently, Choti Mataji joined us with the rest of our group and we climbed the final few steps. Reaching the temple, I was astounded to see that it was completely empty. There were no pilgrims there, not even the pujari. I was taken aback, wondering where the auspicious sounds had come from. Meanwhile, Ma went ahead to the small shrine and offered pranam by putting her head to the ground. When she rose, I observed that on her forehead was the customary tilak of the vermilion sandal paste, grains of rice, and a tulsi leaf. I took a photograph and captured the moment. After Ma's Mahasamadhi and the completion of Ma's temple in Kainchi and Rishikesh, I made a pilgrimage to Purnagiri. Ma had taken me to Devi all those years ago and I felt it was for me a silent initiation into the new life that was to begin. I went to offer my gratitude to Purnagiri Devi for having blessed me with 37 years of sublime and blissful life at the feet of Ma. I visited the dark bungalow in Boom. Everything had changed. A modern structure had replaced the old rest house. There was now a well-planned garden instead of a forest-like grove. But the well from which I had drawn water for Ma was still there. I drank from it. Then I walked to the riverbed. The same rocks, water flowing gently, and the setting sun. I could see her footprints on the sands of time.